So my sister friend nicknamed me Peaches. It was inspired by a conversation I had with her daughter who was curious about my proficiency in an indigenous language. So she asks,
And Thando, you know how to speak Zulu.
and I said yes. Then she shook her head, frowned, and then said,
But you're peach.
I envied how her interpretation of normality and race was still in their twilight zone. She didn't say, but you're white, nor did she make a reference to albinism. The stories that were attached to our bodies were still sketchy in her mind, but society will inevitably erode any independence she has left to interpret both her humanity and mine. She was still going to learn about the centuries old myths that are socially scripted onto our bodies. And when I was her age, I too was beginning to learn that the body is an archive of stories loaded with biological myths that have a socioeconomic and political consequence. Now, the mythologies that I will discuss today pertain to normality, race, and beauty. Now, in the Western world, the narrative of normality descended onto the human body centuries ago, where many people were made to suffer from this notion, such as disabled people and other minority groups, which would include persons with albinism. Now, in the 1700s, African Americans with vitiligo and albinism were an inconvenient existence to a slave economy that was profiting from racial ideologies. Now, there were several philosophical deliberations, but the one that was most convenient for the status quo was to classify albinism and vitiligo as a deviation from the human condition. In other words, an abnormality. Now, the body of albinism moves through the 1800s, where narratives of the normal body came about, and eugenics later documented albinism as a defect, which resulted in an array of violations. Now, centuries later, my body is still made to remember this legacy because I'm still described as having a congenital disease or disorder, and I am still defined pejoratively as an albino, a word also used to describe albinotic animals. And on that note, the correct terminology is persons with albinism, not albino. Now, when I was about 11 years old, I had a brief stint as a child actress. I was cast in a children's educational program in South Africa known as Takalani Sesame, which was an adaptation of Sesame Street. I was cast as a character named Mbali, and I remember that on my first episode, I was with my Muppet friend Zuzu, and we were singing about a crooked penny. An article was written independently to summarize the character descriptions. First, Madimpo, 35 years old, speaks Sesotho and English. She's a mother type to the kids on the street. Then, Tsidi, 7 years old, daughter of Dimpo and Saile. She speaks English, Sesotho, and Afrikaans. Then, Mona, a young blind girl. Thando, a young albino girl. Now remember, I was actually cast as a character named Mbali. I was not cast as myself. And Mona was not cast as herself either. Secondly, Mona and I are the only two characters who do not have a character description. We have a condition description, subtly communicating that all there is to the characters is their condition. 12 years pass, and I go back into my media life. Now, I was a prosecutor when I was scouted to model for Fashion Week, and took some convincing, but I eventually agreed because I was hopeful that the representation might provide positive options of portrayal for albinism. So I closed the show for Fashion Week, and the interviews pour in. First from South Africa, then from all over the world. And initially, this was exciting. But with time, I felt an enduring sense of ambivalence after noticing the running theme on how a body like mine is documented. Headlines: Albino model shatters stereotypes. South African model revels in her albino skin. I would feel my stomach tightening, signaling to me that I was experiencing a quiet kind of violence. The continued namelessness in headlines unmade me as a person and remolded me into a condition. Every article, indiscriminately, had a medical explanation of my existence alongside my story. Now, our bodies are a historical document, carrying narratives from the past to the present to the future. The narrative of abnormality is a 300-year-old inscription imposed on the human body that promulgated an intolerance for human diversity. It refuses to even imagine one's humanity outside of their condition, creating a disassociation from a holistic, layered, and relatable human experience. But the inquiry does not end here, because I have another story loaded onto my body that is marked with historical oppression and dehumanization: my race. Now, although scientists unanimously agree that race is not a biological fact, but it is certainly a socio-political reality. Now, as we continue, let's step back into the institutional memory of race that is inscribed onto our bodies. Race classifications were conjured up in the 1700s, where the somatic features of human bodies were placed in arbitrary hierarchies. The classifications were Mongoloid, Caucasoid, and Negroid. The people who were classified as Negroid were designated as ugly, uncivilized, and inferior. And what became known as Negroid features were those that resemble my own: a flat nose, thick lips, and woolen hair. And some of the people who were designated as Negroid were located in a part of the world where I am from, sub-Saharan Africa. They are my family, my culture, my language, my name, my identity. And every bit of that existence has been structurally attacked through institutions of oppression. Now let's come back to my media experience. My modeling career was generating interest internationally. And subsequently, it seemed as if every media house received the same interview script. Every interview focused on superstition and ritual killings surrounding albinism in parts of Africa. However, whenever an American or European news agency wanted to cover the story, I found myself multitasking. I was trying to answer the question on one hand, but also trying to mitigate against misrepresentation on another. And this was stressful, because I wanted to raise the much needed albinism awareness and activism without reinforcing harmful and negative stereotypes to the rest of the world against Africa. For instance, look at some of the trolling comments on the comment section after my interview with a European newspaper. Comment 1: I know a witch doctor that would give 5 goats for some of her bones. Comment 2: Africans practice witchcraft, voodoo, and black magic, so it's no surprise that albinos are kidnapped and slaughtered for their body parts. That continent is full of evil and superstition. Now, this particular context would pit 2 historically prejudiced groups up against one another, creating compounded prejudice and compounding accountability. I was at the intersection of 2 identities that were fully part of me, but each being vulnerable to racial discrimination: my albinism based on color, and being a Black African based on race and nation. Now, while I was processing all of this, I was still in the fashion and beauty ecosystem, and I was actually supposed to be focusing on my photo shoots. Now, I was working in this industry as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pale-skinned model, features that are typically revered in a world that promotes the Cinderella archetype of beauty. Now, while I seemed to share the same features as the perceived paradigm of beauty, those features have a very different currency in a body like mine. My race and the abnormality associated with me having albinism disrupt the dominant perspective of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed fashion model. Now, the fashion world is still quite complicit in sustaining the conventional beauty construct, so the culture would try to reconceptualize me into an image it's more familiar with. And I'll give you an example. A prominent agency required that I change my natural hair to a weave as a precondition of representing me. And during this time, I was still nurturing the courage of embracing the unique biological markers of albinism by frequently showing my eyebrows and eyelashes as pale. However, I would usually receive unsettling comments about how incomplete my face looked whenever I didn't darken my brows and eyelashes. And it became obvious. that features that are typically defined as Black and features accompanying albinism were culturally devalued. But this is a layered inquiry, because my gender also does add to this. Now, I had chosen representation in the fashion and beauty industry, where beauty, if approached purely from a commercial standpoint, is a highly oppressive construct, because it's used as a commodity and it's not used as an expression of humanity. Now, commodifying beauty to the disadvantage of women in particular is an age-old phenomenon seen in the example of Circassian women. Now, they were pale-skinned, blue-eyed, blonde-haired women whose features became a stereotype that would later define a new image interpretation of world beauty. Their eugenic uniqueness held the world in awe, but became the very same uniqueness that resulted in their exploitation as commercial commodities. They were sold off as sex slaves to powerful, wealthy men, and by selling them off as one would a product, these women lost complete control over their own bodies. Now, I was observing the prejudice that was narrated onto human bodies through institutions of cultural influence, by seeing what had happened to those who came before me and experiencing what was happening to me. So this prompted me to set a different tone on what the interpretations of my story and my body should be. Because the features we have, the types of hair we have, the color of eyes we have, the color of skin we have, all fall under dominant interpretations of perception in history. I had to learn how to re-narrate the story of my body and transform its dominant interpretations by using tools of re-narration targeted at storytelling institutions such as media. Because the treatment of my body as a personal asset and the content of that story as a cultural asset matters. Now, I'm going to share with you some of my tools of re-narration for inclusive representation. 1, having equal control on representation. Now, this can be done through shared, creative, and editorial control over the image and story presented. 2, narrative expansion. Now, single narratives repeated many times over become stereotypes. So I would literally place my body within varying narratives, moving from a women's campaign to a shoot about reimagining Africa, and then to albinism reform policies. 3, for representation to be sustainable in any industry, including the fashion and beauty sector, a value chain that requires robust and direct inclusive representation culturally and economically becomes critical. 4, using pro-equality ideological guidelines such as intersectional feminism and disability rights advocacy. 5, acknowledging the multifaceted nature of identity by considering the humanity of more than one identity group. 6, the power of inclusive narratives is their innate respect for human diversity. Now, there's a wonderful Native American proverb that says, "We do not inherit the land from our fathers. We borrow it from our children." When I think of my friend's daughter's state of transition, she was posing an opportunity to the future, to learn about the diverse expression of humanity, to see the story of our bodies as institutions marked by a life force of multiplicity, personhood, integrity, and sovereignty. This is a story that reminds me of a humanity that is possible if we commit to it. Every time my friend calls me Peaches.